So I recently finished watching the Netflix program called Barbarians, and I actually must say I really enjoyed it. I wasn't sure what to expect, and the reviews have been somewhat mixed. Some of the historical accuracy is a little bit dubious, but visually it looks great, and I actually rather enjoyed the story as well. Now, for those of you who don't know, this program is set in the province of Germania, as the Romans called it, back around the 1st century AD. This province really encompasses large areas of what today would be Germany and some of the Netherlands as well, and further afield too. But really it's about the interaction between the Romans and these various Germanic tribes in the run-up to the very famous Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. But what I want to talk about today is something connected to the language as they are spoken, because take a look.
Caesar sanctae urbis Romae Augustus, novum legatum ad Germania misit, senatorem Publium Quinctilium Varum.
Verstehst du, was er sagt?
Well, if you ever did any Latin at school, then probably the answer is yes, because very cool, the language being spoken by the Romans in Barbarians is indeed Latin, and the correct classical variety. From what I can tell, I'm not a Latin speaker myself, although I have dabbled with the language somewhat as part of my degree. It seems to be fairly accurate, actually. It seems that apart from a few small mistakes, that they have the accent down quite well. It's the right form of Latin that we find attested. And actually, if you want to know more about this, a fellow history channel, the Metatron, has a good video about the Latin in which he goes into it in depth. And actually, I think it's almost every scene where Latin is spoken he goes into and he talks about there. So I'll link that there. But essentially, it's the right brand of Latin. It's classical Latin, so it's being pronounced in the way that we believe it would have been pronounced during the Roman period of about this time. So words like Caesar, Varus, and Germania, rather than the later forms of ecclesiastical Latin, which might be more like Caesar, Varus, or Germania. Obviously sounding a bit more like Italian because it's closer in chronology to modern Italian than to the classical Latin. Now this is very cool, but can we say the same for the language being spoken by the Germanic peoples?
Vergesst das, was sagt er?
Die Römer wollen abkamen.
Now, is this as accurate as the language we heard being spoken by the Romans for this period? Well, quite obviously, no. And the reason for this is that what he is speaking in this scene, and actually what the Barbarians speak throughout the series, is modern German. So German as you'd find it spoken, modern High German to be specific, throughout Germany today, and arguably in Switzerland and Austria with variations. And what this would be like if they did the same for the Romans as they'd done for the Germanic peoples here is, because the Germanic peoples are speaking German, it would be like having the Romans speaking modern day Italian rather than having them speaking Latin. Now, this is necessarily quite a nitpicky point, but I thought it'd be interesting because this gives me an opportunity to look at which language would they have spoken if they were being as accurate to the Germanic peoples as they are being for the Latin-speaking Romans. And actually, I think it's a German show, so it makes sense that they're speaking modern German, because also we don't really get that many scenes with Latin being spoken, and the idea is that you, the viewer, are in the same position as the Barbarians, as the Germanic peoples, because they're the protagonists in the story. So having Latin as a classical Latin as the language being used, it helps put you in the same position as the protagonists in the story. So I like what they've done, and I don't think it's a problem that they haven't used the quote-unquote accurate language. I don't think that's an issue. I just think it's an interesting point to make. And the language we would find being spoken by the Germanic tribes, actually this is what makes them Germanic, it's largely a linguistic label for this period, is Proto-Germanic. And a few points about this term. First, to take a look at the Germanic part, because a lot of the time people see the word Germanic and they recognize rightly that it's connected to German, but often people conflate the two terms. And the fact of the matter is that Proto-Germanic or Germanic and German are not the same thing. They are related, and ultimately they come from the same etymological root, but they don't mean the same thing. Now, if we take a look at what German means, it's a native or inhabitant of Germany or a person of German descent, or specifically linguistically, it's a West Germanic language used in Germany, Austria, and parts of Switzerland, and by communities in the US and elsewhere, spoken by around 100 million people. So this is specifically referring to the modern state of Germany, and before that, people of German descent. However, Germanic is somewhat different in its scope, and to look at just the linguistic label, it relates to or denotes the branch of the Indo-European language family that includes English, German, Dutch, Frisian, and the Scandinavian languages. There are a few more. This is a somewhat simplified definition, but that is essentially what Germanic is. It's relating to either a group of people, so here we might describe the Germanic tribes who lived not only in modern-day Germany and Austria and Switzerland, but also in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in the rest of Scandinavia, and further east as well. But linguistically also it refers to this whole language family, just as we might refer to the Slavic language family or to the Romance language family. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I see all the time in my comments and online and in other places people using German and Germanic interchangeably or saying that English comes from German or something like that. This is not the case. English and German are both Germanic languages. They both come from Proto-Germanic in actual fact, to the language we assume they're speaking in, well, or that they would have spoken before the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, the Germanic peoples. Not that there's a linguistic change after the battle, but you catch my drift. So English doesn't come from German. They're both Germanic languages. And that's an important point to make there. And the reason it's called Proto-Germanic, this proto in front of it, actually denotes that it's a language that is not very well attested. There are a few attestations of this language, but nowhere near regularly attested. And so large parts of this language have to be reconstructed. And that's why you add a proto, and the proto, rather than having a pre-Germanic, which is another term that's used, is because proto languages come from comparative reconstruction. So you compare the descendants of the language to try and figure out what the parent language was like. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. The reason we don't have to do this for classical Latin is, of course, because the Romans wrote lots of things down. We have an incredible amount of classical Latin, and then from later Latin as well. So it's a lot easier to have dialogue in classical Latin because there's so much remaining and attested. Remembering that the Germanic peoples were not a literate people at all for a long time, and then you do get the runic script that comes in, but that's in a, we don't get a lot that is left from the early runic scripts. Lots of it was probably done on wood, so a lot of it rots away. Now we do get some inscriptions with runes being used, and from that we can work out a few things about the Proto-Germanic language, but the bulk of runic inscriptions come from quite a bit later, when this has already diverged and changed into various other groups with different branches splitting off at different times. Now, to look at Proto-Germanic, we can get some idea, some flavor of what it's like by trying to reconstruct it from the languages that have descended from it today. So that's where the Germanic language family comes in. Some of them I mentioned earlier. And you can do this by looking at modern day descendants. So we could look at, for example, Dutch, or English, German, Danish, Faroese, Yiddish. You can add basically any Germanic language in there and try to compare them and reconstruct it that way. However, these oftentimes have had quite a few developments along the way. Remember, it's been a long time since Proto-Germanic, since this period, and a lot of things have happened to the language. So actually a more fruitful exercise is to look at older languages that have been attested, because these are closer chronologically to this time period we want to get at. And the four that are most often looked at are Old Norse, Old English, Old High German, and Gothic. Now, if you want to add some other things into the mix, you could potentially look at Old Saxon and Old Frisian as well. Now, Simon Roper has a really great video on how this comparative reconstruction works here. He's reconstructed the word stone and taken that all the way back. And I'll link that here if you want to take a look at that. But I'll take another example just to show you a few other things that we can do with this process as well if we try and reconstruct the word land. So if we take the word land, we can then lay out in several Germanic languages, or in fact all of them if we really want to, what the word for land is. And by simply looking at this paradigm, we can see that this is actually a poor example. I realized this after I chose it, because actually pretty much all the forms are exactly the same, and so far as I can tell, only the West Frisian in this paradigm, which is lawn rather than land, and you can see here in the difference column that what has happened is that we have a D has disappeared, and that the vowel has lengthened as well. I think in the other Frisian languages it's also a bit irregular, but that's clearly a Frisian thing, and in all the others it's land. Now, actually, if we look at some similar cognates, if we look at land in English and we look at some similar constructions of words like the word for hand and sand, we get the same pattern emerging with lawn, harn, sarn, barn, strawn. And with this, we can probably guess that this is a regular sound change rather than some kind of exception. And actually, if we look at older forms, we can surmise that what has happened is that it's lost the D at some point in Frisian, and then because of this, the vowel before it has become extended. It's become a lengthened vowel because you've lost a consonant. This happens a lot of the time in languages. When you lose a sound, then the vowel before it or after it will become extended because of this. And that's why we get this form. And actually, therefore, it doesn't seem likely that the ancestor form will have been more like Frisian, because all the other examples show, a really high degree of similarity, and it's just Frisian. That looks weird. And this is true if we look at the older languages. Remember, these are closer to chronologically to what the Proto-Germanic will have been like. We can see that actually that form that we had, that lon in modern Frisian, was just lant in Old Frisian, and that's a change that has occurred. We get a few changes here and there. The O to A in Old English and Old Frisian, so the Anglo-Frisian branch, is probably more of a pronunciation thing than a really great difference, as potentially is the DT change in Old High German as well. So we are left with a Proto-Germanic form that is something like London, and with a kind of nasal consonant at the end, and that's been surmised by looking at other forms, like looking at the Proto-Indo-European form, when there probably was some kind of N behind it that has been lost, and then the vowel has changed again to a more nasalized vowel. Now, I realized this wasn't a great example because there were so many that are exactly the same, and actually a more interesting example might be looking at the word wolf, which is a common theme throughout Barbarians as well, the wolf, so I thought that would be interesting. Now, I've skipped the modern step because most modern languages are almost identical in how they call wolves. But if we see here wolf, it's very similar in Old English, Old High German, in Old Saxon and Old Frisian, and these are actually all part of the West Germanic language family. But crucially, the Gothic and Old Norse are different, and I've highlighted the differences here. Gothic is an East Germanic language, whilst Old Norse is a North Germanic language. And you can see in the differences category that, of course, we have a difference in the vowel, but that's probably not really that significant. But importantly, in Gothic, we have a final S behind the word, and this is just in the nominative form. Whereas in Old Norse, we have a few changes going on. So we don't have that W, that's gone, but it is lengthened. So again, we've lost a sound, so we increase the length of the vowel. And we have an R behind it. We actually know from studying Old Norse and Gothic is that in Gothic, the nominatives a lot of the time had an S behind it, and where you had an S or a Z, what we assume happened in the Proto-Germanic, you then got an R in Old Norse. And this is how we demise that actually the word, or surmise rather, that the word in Proto-Germanic was something like wolfaz, so with this Z sound after it. We know that in Gothic, this final Z devoices, so a Z to a S. You just don't use the voice when pronouncing it. In Old Norse, we get a process called rhoticism, which means that this S sound goes to a R, or a Z sound goes to a R, and we know from the West Germanic languages that they simply lose that ending. So that's why we get wolf today, but ulver in Old Norse and wolfs in Gothic, which is very interesting, and that allows us an insight into this language that was being spoken by Germanic peoples around the time of the 1st century. As I said, this is a form, and that's what the little asterisk denotes, a form that we don't actually find anywhere. So this is pure conjecture, but it's based on this quite rigorous process of reconstruction, of looking at these older languages and even modern languages as well in some cases, to try and work backwards and figure out what this earlier form will have been. Because languages don't really conjure up sounds out of nowhere, so it's very unlikely that Proto-Germanic would have been wolf and that Gothic decided to go wolves and Old Norse decided to stick an R on the end. It's much more likely that you've lost things, and that fits in with much broader patterns of what words do, and it's by finding these patterns and analysing them and suggesting what this descendant or the ancestor could have been that makes it very interesting. We do have some things written in a kind of Proto-Germanic language. So this is actually an inscription in some form of either Proto-Norse or Proto-Germanic from the Gollehus horn, which is, I've actually seen it in the National Museum in Denmark, in Copenhagen. And what it reads is, I, Cleogast of Holt, made the horn. And you can see there that at the top, this is probably a quite accurate to word order sentence rather than being particularly poetic, which is often a problem with these older languages when written down. We don't know how much the word order was like the spoken word order. If we think of, for example, poetry in Shakespeare's time, it probably didn't follow the same rules and syntax in sentences as people just speaking normally. And just to show you quickly what this looks like compared to the modern German, you can see that there certainly are features that are recognizable. So the echte Ich, obviously the name, but noting that the name doesn't have added on constructions as we see in the Proto-Germanic, which was grammatically a lot more complex. And you can see that on Holt as well. Horn, we can clearly see Horna to horn in German. That's clearly related to one another, which is very, very interesting that we do get things that we can recognize. This is just a short little sentence, but I thought it'd be quite nice to put on there. But as you can see from the Proto-Germanic of Ekleugastes Holtias Horna Tawido, this language, if you did a whole film with the main characters having to speak dialogue in this language, it wouldn't be great. Anyway, chaps, that's just my take on it, but let me know, would you like to see a series like Barbarians with some more Proto-Germanic being reconstructed and slapped in there? I personally don't know. I certainly wouldn't like to be the translator, or can you even use translator, creator for the Proto-Germanic in a TV series, although there are some very clever linguists out there who I'm sure could pull it off, and it would be very interesting to see. But do let me know. I thought this was an interesting point because a lot has been made about the Latin being used in the show, which I think was really interesting and really cool that they're using old languages and using it well. I appreciate that a lot, and it really did tickle my fancy as a big history nerd and a languages nerd to see not only this old language being used, but also to see some, what seemed to be really quite accurate outfits for the Romans. Some of the barbarian stuff was maybe a little bit out there, but then again, we don't have an awful lot of information on exactly what they were wearing. So very cool, all told. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this one. Let me know in the comments below if you want to see anything else on the Netflix Barbarian series, then please just ask. And until then, I have been Hilbert, or Hilbertias maybe, if we're going to make that a Proto-Germanic form, but don't quote me on that. And this has been The History.